Thank you.
Yes. So I'll have to shift the PowerPoint.
While we're loading the PowerPoint, I'm wondering, how many people in the audience went to Rio?
Ed,
Of those that did not go to Rio, how many people wanted to go to Rio? For the conference.
Oh, for the conference.
How many people really wanted to go to Rio?
yeah, a lot.
Okay. I'm curious because there is, I think, right now, a substantial divide in the environmental community about whether it was worth it. And some see Rio as the nail in the coffin of the environmental mega conferences. I remember hearing about this at Johannesburg, and since then we've had Copenhagen and Cancun and another Rio. What can we expect from these things? Is it worth the miles? Is it worth the emissions?
Oh, there's the, you have the right, oh, right, there you go.
And you see a lot of very unhappy comments about Rio. A flop, a failure, a bust, disappointing lack of leadership, grossly lacking in concrete action, almost nothing new. And the outcome document, which most people focus on, entitled The Future We Want. There was an NGO letter that was circulated, signed by more than 1,000 NGOs, saying this is the future we don't want. Rio+20 failed to remove fossil fuel subsidies, failed to protect oceans, particularly the high seas, failed to address women's reproductive health, failed to set up a $30 billion development fund for developing nations, failed to ease technology transfer. This is just some of the grievances of civil society with respect to the outcome document. And the question is, are we seeing the death of the mega conference? And should we be spending our money and energies in more productive ways? I'll put that out there as the foil. We did see, in contrast to Rio or to Stockholm, where you had hallmark outcomes, things that go in textbooks. You didn't see as many big things come out of Rio, but you saw a lot of small things, or modest things. We saw, for the first time, the concept of the green economy actually was embedded in the G77. That initially they saw the green economy as a protectionist framework, and they actually bought into green economy as a concept. Now, what does that mean? Who knows? But they actually have embraced this as a concept, and that can frame further development. There's renewed support for assessment methodologies, indicators that go beyond GDP as a measure of developmental progress. Corporate sustainability reporting, there's an effort to get a mandatory system in place that failed, and instead you have kind of some soft language and friends of paragraph 47 pushing this forward with a few countries in NASDAQ, but it's kind of the coalition of the like-minded. Coming out of Johannesburg, there was back in 2002, we saw highlights for sustainable production and consumption. That led to Marrakesh program of action that was never adopted until Rio+20. So there finally was international consensus around sustainable production and consumption via a 10-year program of work. There was global consensus against ocean fertilization. The question is this new? Not really. It reflects an earlier agreement in 2008, 2009, but it's reinforcing something that a lot of people cared about. And there were, depending on who you talk to, 692, 700 commitments through pledges, initiatives. The UN estimates that this is worth more than $500 billion. And I believe I saw Jacob saying that this could lead to trillions of dollars of investments. We also saw seeds for potential future progress. And this is where I think it's the most interesting in terms of the outcome document. Three things in particular. Sustainable development goals, at least agreeing to the idea of SDGs that would be universally applicable. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But this requires further action by the General Assembly, further negotiations. We don't know even what the categories of SDGs would be, let alone what they would say. Second, upgrading UNEP. We've talked about strengthening UNEP for years. Finally, we agreed to upgrade UNEP. We didn't agree to an independent agency, but it's upgrading. And it calls for the General Assembly to adopt a resolution in the next, not this September, but a year, on what upgrading will constitute. And this could entail increased funding from the UN regular budget. And then third, there's a lot of disappointment with the UN Commission on Sustainable Development. A lot of people feel that the first 10 years were moderately useful, but since Johannesburg it hasn't been of much use. And the Future We Want called for the replacement of CSD by a Sustainable Development Forum. Great idea, and the language is really interesting. But I question whether this will be any more successful than CSD as a political forum for bringing everyone together. From a political economy perspective, it's very interesting to see the diversification of actors. There's a geopolitical shift happening. It used to be you had this grand bargain between the developed and the developing countries. And, yeah, the countries with economies in transition, we didn't know quite how they fit into that. But the developed countries. And then you had the BRICS. Now you have much more heterogeneity in the actors. You have UNEP in India giving money to UNEP. They're also getting programming. But they have become donors to India, to other countries. You see a lot of technological innovation, a lot of the commitments came from the other countries. And then you also see the expansion of norms into the developed countries. The SDGs are one area you see this in terms of applying them to some of the more developed countries. But you also look at the deal that was cut in Durban. That we're not just talking about reductions of emissions from developed countries, we're now talking about applying it more universally. So I think that this is, who knows how it's going to exactly play out, but we're seeing, I think, a very important development. Second, we're seeing a greater role for business. There wasn't much action by business at Rio. There was a certain amount of presence by businesses in Johannesburg, and there was a lot more here. And the initiatives that they launched and highlighted, there's a lot of development. This is pretty exciting. And third, a lot of the side events that we saw, I shouldn't say side events, a lot of the events that were held in parallel. Some of them were side events, but a lot of them just happened to be held in the same general area at the same general time. And these led to frameworks for UNEP and others to work on judicial training, to work on further development of principles of environmental law. And so you see other people referring to Rio+20 as a stepping stone, but not a turning point. We're moving toward a new approach, but it's not that moment in time where we say, this is where everything changed. And I want to comment briefly on why I think we saw the problems we did. First of all, there were a lot more voices and a lot more chaos. With that, you need more time to reach consensus, or you need to have a totally different approach. But there really was very little time for negotiation. If you look at Johannesburg, you had 4 prep comms, 2 weeks each. Here you had 3 prep comms of 2 to 3 days, and you couldn't even get into discussions about other proposals. And so people would, I remember John Matuzak complaining, we still have time, let's talk. But you couldn't really get into it because you couldn't finish the discussions. Some of that's due to a lack of funding. There are questions about whether having more time would have made a difference. I think it would have, because a lot of the things that were cut out by Brazil, when you got to the heads of state coming in, Brazil taking over responsibility for negotiations, they basically cut out most of what wasn't agreed to, and there have been substantial progress made over the previous 2 months in agreeing to those things. So I think some of the things that were cut out would have stayed in there. I also think that some of those seeds for future development, like the SDGs or what constitutes upgrading UNEP, those could have been further developed. I don't know that you would have gotten the final deal, but there would have been more details, more time to reach the details. I also think this is something that people don't talk about, but if you look at the Rio Declaration, that is really elegant. The language is clean, it's nicely framed. The principles that are in the Rio Declaration are shorter than some of the headings you see in the future we want. It's just really elegant. Same thing for the MDGs. And I would posit the reason for this is that in those cases, the UN found somebody they trusted, somebody competent, somebody who would consult with others, who consulted and drafted. And you had a single organic document which was then vetted. But here you start with opening it up and say to everybody, what do you want? And you get hundreds of responses last fall. And then the Secretariat needs to figure out how to put them together. And there just wasn't as coherent a whole. You read the language, and there are nice nuggets, but you have to dig for them. I also think that there's a lot of convention fatigue, and some of it's ambivalence. We have all these provisions that aren't being implemented, and you have some countries that don't want to see, affirmatively do not want to see new binding agreements. This is final slide. For me, the real question is, what does all this mean? Are we witnessing a reconceptualization of multilateralism? It's not just a question of what happened at Rio or what happened in the other environmental context. You also look at the G20, the G7, the G8. These mega conferences that are supposed to set the policy agenda, how much are they actually setting the policy agenda? And how much is action just happening? We saw a lot of very exciting innovations. These were plurilateral or unilateral. Aruba saying, we're going to get off fossil fuels by 2020, and we're going to spend up to $1 billion on energy efficiency. That's really exciting. If they can do it, others can do it. And you saw a lot of the, basically, initiatives of like-minded entities. And the entities are not just governments, but you have governments and businesses and NGOs. This is similar to what we saw in Johannesburg, but I think that they were more developed this time than in Johannesburg. Does this replace the old approach of consensus-based conventions? Or are we looking at a diversification of approaches? I believe it's the latter. I think that just as we saw in the US in the 80s and 90s, the rapid growth of voluntary initiatives, corporate social responsibility, beyond compliance, that you have these initiatives that complement the regulatory framework. And they often can move faster, they're more nimble, you can test things out. And I think that that is one of the values of these initiatives. I still strongly believe in the value of the conventions, in the value of the secretariats, in the value of norms. But I think that these are very important complements. And I expect that it's similar in business. Some entities, some businesses try a new approach, everyone else is looking. Does that yield benefits? If it does, you see them not necessarily joining the initiative, but adopting a similar approach. I think the question is, if this is one of the big events that comes out, and one of the big takeaways from Rio+20, these 692 plus initiatives, how do we maximize their effectiveness? How do we hold people accountable for their commitments? And this was something that Johannesburg was supposed to be all about public-private partnerships. And they were registered, but there was no requirement for reporting. There was no tracking. You couldn't even, we're not talking about legal accountability, but just moral accountability. There was no real framework for seeing what worked, what didn't, if people actually followed through with their commitments. And when they did follow through, what the impacts were. The other question that I would like to put out there is if Rio+20 was useful for any of the above listed reasons or for others, how do we communicate that? How do you say that this has real value, that it's worth the money, worth the time, worth the emissions? And I say that because there is, certainly in the U.S., there is a growing antipathy about the relevance and utility of international environmental institutions. And you see this in some of the law schools who are having to cancel their classes on international environmental law because not enough students sign up. You need a minimum of 6, 7, 8 students to have a class. They're not getting sufficient enrollment. I'm not saying this is everywhere, but I'm hearing reports of this. How do we keep people, how do we place these processes in perspective? And what is the value of this particular mega conference? Because it's hard to say what the relevance and utility and outcome of Johannesburg was. You get 2 of these in a row that are deemed to be failures. It's going to be very hard to have another one.
Okay, thank you very much.